Today we're talking to Stewart Prodger, who wears many hats. He's works with SCSN or with Neighbourhood Watch Scotland, sits on the SCSN board, is involved with the Scottish Flood Forum, and works, I think, mainly, is that right, Stewart, at the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency?
Yeah, you're close. It's the Scottish Environment Protection Agency.
Environment Protection Agency.
We sometimes put mental into the environment. Don't worry about it. Yeah, my day is classed as Principal Officer for Responders and Communities, which involves concentrating on working to ensure that we are best serving, particularly through our flood forecasting and warning services, the needs for the responder community, the blue lights, the local authorities and other agencies, but also are very firmly rooted in helping supply information, answers and services to the public in a way that they most need them.
So that kind of covers what I was going to ask you what you do in your role and what SEPA does, but you've kind of said that. So, and is that SEPA broadly then what they do? Yeah.
SEPA's got two primary service areas. One is tied into our One Planet Prosperity model. One half is looking at environmental regulation, which environment protection and improvement, which is emissions to air, to water, to land. It's making sure that waste crime is reduced, that we're working to protect every aspect of Scotland's environment. And the other half is as SEPA, as Scotland's Flood Forecasting, Warning and Flood Risk Management Authority, which covers several different aspects of flooding. It does not include flood defence management, which is almost entirely the local authorities. Scottish Water is the drainage authority on the whole, and SEPA operates the National Flood Forecasting and Warning Services, both a public service called Floodline and also a daily service through a Met Office and SEPA Scottish Flood Forecasting Service, which every day issues a 5-day look ahead at flood risk, so that the responders, the people who are looking after all our best interests, get the best possible warning and idea of what they need to do on the ground to prepare for what's forecast.
Cool. Well, that's a good summary then of Scottish Environment Protection Agency. So next question I just wanted to ask you was about the fact that you obviously recently attended our Climate Change and Community Safety webinar. So I just wanted to kind of find out from you a bit, what were your main takeaways from that event?
I think that probably the main takeaway was that it was reassuring that people out with the most obvious sectors, if you like, are actually really waking up to what climate change impacts could physically mean, not just from the kind of geographic environmental perspective, but actually on a micro level and thinking, oh my goodness, that's going to have a real effect on our services that we provide through social work, that it's going to have economic impacts on those that live near the coasts. It's going to impact in so many different physical, in terms of health, mental health, long-term health, caring responsibilities, physical sides of, property, transport, travel, and similar. But it was so refreshing to hear people from a variety of different places actually, get together and start recognizing that there are so many things that climate change is related to that can have an impact on the way that we live and the way that we want to not just survive, but thrive.
Yeah, it was one of the things, I guess it didn't seem at first like an issue that was maybe for the Scottish Community Safety Network, but when we did start to sort of have a bit of a brainstorm on climate change and how it might impact us, it became quickly quite obvious that there were numerous areas, and it actually became quite a long list of different areas that it can impact on, and it's things like road safety, rail safety, landslips, as you said, coastal erosion, wildfires, which is something again that a lot of people probably aren't so aware of a problem in Scotland. But
it's interesting that because one of your colleagues kind of did a pre-event interview with me to get an idea of some of the the impacts from climate change onto community safety, and I gave her a few topic areas. And I said, these are maybe not well understood. And wildfire was one of them. There has been an increase in wildfires in Scotland. And for instance, we operate the weekly water scarcity reporting process as well, so that we can see from a very real perspective just where those constraints, where those impacts actually are. And it's very easy for you to say, well, isn't it great that we're getting less rain in the northeast around kind of Moray and that sort of area. And isn't it great? I can't believe that we've got a drought warning on the Isle of Skye, or we've got an issue up with Orkney suddenly requiring rainfall. But what they forget is that has a huge impact on the services that people are going to be needing, calling on. So simple things like having enough water in a reservoir, which will actually not require any kind of water usage reduction sounds from Scottish Water. It has the wildfire side of things, has a huge economic impact on the rural community. So if you think about it, go into the lockdown for a period. How many more people were emerging from their home areas and discovering new parts of Scotland? They were getting out there, they were having, for their mental health, for their physical well-being, for my sanity, which is, dodgy at the best of times, to be able to get out to somewhere, into a forest, up into the hills. Now, if you are less experienced, if you are having more less experienced people out there doing these things, and they're wild camping, they're lighting fires, they're doing all manner of things. If you couple that with some of the impacts from climate change being, warmer, drier areas, as well as increased storms and increased flooding, those extremes, then the potential for fires goes up. Not just because of the way that the ground is drier, this has got less water then to actually put out a fire, but also the very fact that you've got the habitats who are the wildlife as well as flora and fauna really looking to survive extreme weather events and extremes of climate change. And I don't think it's ever been so prevalent and ever so honest and open that we rely on everything from our insect world to every other aspect of the natural environment to live as human beings. So to not look after it in that holistic way is madness. And climate change has really ratcheted up some of the issues, and wildfire is one of them.
Yeah, and amongst other ones as well that stuck out for myself were, like you're kind of saying there, the impact that you can't separate the environment from people and how we behave. And this summer was probably unusually warm for an extended spell in certain parts of Scotland, which people were very happy about. But at the same time, it had some immediate consequences in that we saw quite a significant number of water deaths, drownings, with people going to obviously cool down, not being aware of water safety and things like that. Potential for the future as well is that if warmer weather affects human behaviour in other ways, it could be stuff like when the weather's good, people like to have a drink, and alcohol-related crime, alcohol-related antisocial behaviour, things like that, potentially being impacted on as well. So sort of
that was one of the things that came up in one of the discussions at the the web conference that you guys had organised that I'd never considered. I'd never considered the potential for more people, relaxing closer to home if they were doing day trips, a proper staycation or having a UK holiday. They were enjoying some of the changes, but with that comes, as you say, part of the drinking culture and part of the kind of relax and not thinking about consequences. I had never brought that and equated it to community safety. So that was almost a revelation to me.
Yeah, and I think it was just one of those things when we started really thinking about it, because climate change seemed kind of outside of our main bag. And yet when you started to actually think about the implications of, well, if this happened, well, what's the knock-on effect going to be?
But also, one of the better known things from, extreme temperatures is the effect that it has on different members of the community who are more vulnerable. Now, it's easy to point towards the elderly who are more susceptible to extremes, both in terms of cold and heat. But, for many years, people in Scotland wouldn't have considered that heat was going to be a regular potential threat to them, but it has been. And if you add on to that the increased reliance that some people have been having on things like air conditioning to help manage that, that increases their energy usage, which leads to potential kind of fuel poverty related issues. It puts more of a strain on the very system, the national infrastructure to get energy to where it's needed to service that demand. And when you're still, in some cases, burning fossil fuels, or you're using nuclear energy, or you're not using renewable energy sources, that's actually then contributing to the kind of net CO2 emissions perspective. So it becomes a very kind of difficult cycle if you're not careful. So there are so many kind of different aspects where climate, environment, community safety, and individuals' ability to thrive, not survive. As other people much better qualified than I'll ever be have said, at the moment, we are struggling to manage by using 3 plants worth of resources for this one kind of planet. And the intention when you hear about net zero and you hear about a number of the different descriptions that are going on is as a society to make sure that we recognize the impact we've had, that we do something about it on an adaptation level, but also to fix it in the longer term. And that means reducing our use of various different resources, and as a society actually recognizing where we individually play our part, as well as where we organizationally and governmentally make that difference.
Sure. The next question I had was something that we are already touching on, but I'll just ask you maybe if you want to speak either from a SEPA perspective, Scottish Flood Forum, maybe more so. So what for you are the main issues for community safety around climate change? What are the main ones that you are sort of focused on or looking at?
Well, sorry, you've kind of breached obviously into the world of wildfire and a few other bits and pieces, but let's concentrate on flooding, which is, I suppose, my meat and drink, if you like. So one of the things that's been recognised for many, many years is that one of the most significant direct impacts is global sea level rise. And global sea level rise means a number of different things, and it's not just about the potential threat to a few different coastal communities. Extreme weather brings about more impactful storms. They can bring about damage, not just to the foreshore, but to the way that we live. If you look in Scotland, there's a couple of really obvious examples, which is the air railway line, the electric route that goes from Glasgow down through Renfrewshire, Ayrshire. And how many times have you seen more recently pictures on the evening news of the battering storms which are coming over at Saltcoats? Now, okay, you're saying that's just affecting Saltcoats, that's not me. But how about what's coming up and down that railway line? How about the people who are relying on that for their jobs? How about that for the goods that are being transferred up and down that line from the big distillers further down the coast, for instance, in that arena? So those are just a couple of the different things that make an impact from the coastal side of flooding. Coastal erosion is a big issue. But obviously, the East Coast is the one that is strongest affected. And we are seeing, increased examples of that leading to land slippage. You've only got to look at the braes round Glenbervie as an example, as where there's been, some significant coastal erosion. And then think about inland, you've actually got places like the Rest and Be Thankful, where increased intense rainfall has actually led to, the land being slipped to such a degree that it has land slippage down, affecting the A83, some rail routes and similar. But that, in effect, is meaning that a lot of people in an already kind of vulnerable rural community are being deprived of their lifeline transport link. So it's not just rocks falling onto a road, it's affecting the delivery of goods and services, medical treatment, goods to the supermarkets, supply chain issues, as well as being able to go and get to hospitals to to visit, those that might rely on you as their primary caregiver. So there's a whole range of social consequences which are directly limited to a mixture of climate and other impacts. So to continue on the coastal theme, one of the things that SEPA has done over the last 10 years has hugely increased its coastal flood warning capabilities. And that's recognising the greater impact that's been coming in from higher seas and stronger and more regular storms. The Met Office is regularly publishing, this has been exceeded, this has been the greatest temperature of the year, this has been the biggest storm. Even things like, and this might sound trivial, but the Met Office and its counterparts agreed on a storm naming protocol years ago, and I had a little bit of input into that. And one of the reasons for that is to actually bring the storms to life, to make the media and the other organisations recognise when something was getting to a certain level, and so to help people relate to the fact that actually it was serious, that they needed to do something, they needed to protect themselves, they needed to be aware of the risk to be able to avoid it. So, risks can come from a number of different climate-related sources, but just looking at flooding, intense summer thunderstorms, big, very localised, very hard to predict, massive downfalls in an area where people can least deal with it. In urban areas, for instance, where drainage can't cope, we've seen that in several urban areas very recently. We've talked about the increased summer storms from a coastal tidal and erosion perspective. But those summer thunderstorms, let me give you another, almost an odd example. David, have you ever wild camped even?
Maybe a long time ago when I was a child.
Well, think about the last 18 months in particular. Incidences of people camping, particularly wild camping, has gone up and up because it's been an escape. People are holidaying at home or holidaying within the UK, and quite a lot of them have, gone on to camp in spots. And where do you want to camp? You want to camp in a beautiful area. You might want to camp next to a river. A lot of people do. They might want to camp next to the coast. If you're not familiar with the kind of warning signs, what's going to happen, what the weather forecast actually has an impact on that area, then you're already making a whole range of different people immediately more vulnerable. So a very specific example, take some of the rivers that run through Perthshire particularly. Perthshire, in different aspects of Tayside, you've got lots of kind of gravel islands in the middle of some of the rivers like the Erne, for instance. And it's a really popular spot for people to pitch a tent because it's really shallow. They can have the water trickling past them. It's absolutely idyllic. Then think about a summer thunderstorm that could be happening 5, 10, 15, 20 miles or further upstream from that. So it's dumping a massive amount of water suddenly with very little warning into that area. You're not knowing that because you're in one of the dry spots. You're not hearing the rain, you're not seeing the rain. The first you might be aware of it is when, and I'm not going to call it a tsunami, but we are talking a significantly raised level of water suddenly whooshing its way further downriver. And you can have people really badly affected by that, which ties into what you were saying earlier about the impacts of people utilising these kind of long hot summer days to go and cool off by a dip in the local reservoir, or the unfortunate situation in and around Loch Lomond where we had 3 members of the same family all immediately affected. And ironically, and that was on the weekend, which was the first UN World Drowning Prevention Day. It was horrific. I'm a member of Water Safety Scotland, which has been campaigning hard and fast to educate people more about the dangers of different kind of water-related hazard. And it's all about the prevention of accidental drowning. And that can come from a range of different sources. But who would have thought, if you were sitting on an idyllic summer's evening in the middle of this big gravel and wooded island in the middle of the Erne or the Tay, that 20 miles further upstream, there was a massive amount of water gathering and starting to make its way down towards you. So as a flood warning authority, we do our very level best by having regional alerts out, which are largely weather related. and then local warnings out wherever we've got the infrastructure and the ability to do so to help people, cope with that.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned the coastal storms, actually, because you've just made me realise that, I think it was a couple of years ago now, was the road down from Stranraer to Dromore, which is a small village.
I know it well, yes.
Muller Galloway. Used to go there when I was a kid, and was a friend of my mother's was actually pulled into the sea and died on that road and I remember when I was a kid, the storms could be quite bad and the water would come over the kind of breaks because the road's literally on the coast.
I've been up and down it many times, and we're working with Dumfries and Galloway Council to increase flood warning capability on that very road.
Yeah, because it is that way, like you say, because I presume the reason why they favoured going through, even though the weather must have been quite bad and they could see that, is because to get into Dromore from any other angle, it's a long drive round. So, like you say, if roads get shut off or key routes into towns and communities get shut off, it does potentially cause risks, or maybe people were more likely to take risks to save time and all that kind of stuff. And Look
at the example recently of people driving into flood water. I mean, we consistently remind people that 6 inches, 30 odd centimeters of water is more than enough to float a typical car. The impacts of the bus in Ayrshire, which drove into flood water and had a major kind of incident and multi-agency response to it. We've had people getting their cars stuck in surface water, which is not river and not coastal. So it's when the drains can't cope with the massive amount of water hitting an area and can't get away through either older road drainage channels or similar. So you've got a huge amount of risk within that area, and without being pejorative to anybody individually, people were also incredibly stupid at times, David. And if you and I were driving down towards and you saw this big area of water in front of you, and you couldn't see how deep it was, but you could see that it was covering the pavement, would you drive into it?
No, but I would like to think not anyway.
Yeah. So we're really sympathetic when people obviously have had terrible incidences and experiences, but we've also really got to individually, you, I, every person out there has got to take responsibility for themselves, and they've got to say, look, I've got to be aware of what my risks are here. I'm not. It's the same way that smoking is very clearly marked as a particular type of health hazard. Sorry, I'm not picking on anybody individually, but it is, it's taken a long time, to get people to understand what cause, effect, etc. And I think the majority of people either, ignore or accept those risks. When it comes to motoring, how many years did it take people to eventually obey the legislation which required seatbelts to be worn and to not drink and drive? Because it then became society's no-no rather than just, it's okay to do that. And you've got to take the same approach to many other risks in life, recognizing that they're out there and that you've got a responsibility to yourself. You have to insure your own car, you have to insure your own house, whether you're a tenant or whether you're an owner. It's the same principle about ensuring that you are mitigating any risks to yourself. But government bodies and other agencies have a strong duty of care to make sure that we all do our level best to raise awareness of the risks, to put in protection where it's possible, and to warn people, wherever it's not. So even if you think about that in a term of hierarchy on an individual base, you want to avoid risk wherever possible. You want to protect against it if you can't avoid it, and you want to warn against it if you can't either protect or avoid. And on an individual basis, I'll give you a slight area of humour. I was in the middle of a call the day before yesterday, something right here in my home-based working here, and I was suddenly aware to my right, where there's a window, of a huge plume of smoke. I mean, really a significantly massive plume of smoke. And I suddenly, I stood up and I could see that there was an inferno between me and my next door neighbour. So I belted outside, ran out the back, grabbed a hose, which I always have kind of plugged in at the back, ran round the front and immediately started playing it on that. Somebody else had called the brigade. And it was a neighbour who had, with the best intentions, had just been using a small gas-powered weed burner. And it was a dull, slightly drizzly day. It was reasonably safe conditions to do it, but it set fire to some very dead, dry material at the bottom of the hedge. And we had a full scale, our properties were immediately at risk, cars that couldn't be shifted out, carports and all the rest of it. So I, being the paranoid individual that I am and working in the world of risk, resilience and preparation, yes, of course, I've got a hose already plugged in. Yes, I know it's going to reach all the way around the house. Yes, I'm going to respond quite quickly and no. That's me. In other individual circumstances, you've got people like the Fire and Rescue Service doing these kind of home safety related visits to help people understand what risks from certain activities might be, so that they've got the best chance of understanding that risk to their and their community's safety, but also taking individual action themselves to lower that risk. And I think it's sometimes something we're quite afraid of saying is, you are responsible for managing your own risk. Here are the sources of advice and help and support that's at the back and around you, but you've got to take ownership.
Yeah, I definitely have this shared kind of responsibility between state institutions and the public themselves. Yeah. So moving on to the last wee bit here, just time-wise, I'm noticing. So I'm going to try and bundle these two questions together because they're kind of the same. So how you've kind of talked a wee bit about this first one, prevention, in terms of how we can prevent negative impacts of climate change and that sort of tiered approach and sort of raising awareness, making people aware of what actions they can take, and then warning people where action can't be taken in terms of how to prevent harms related to climate change, I guess, social harms or individual harms. Last wee bit, if you've got any more thoughts on prevention, please feel free to give them and what we can be doing. But also, do you reckon that community safety should be more involved in trying to mitigate or adapt to what's going to happen with climate change or what could happen with climate change? Or do you think there's a role, and if so, what role for community safety in trying to prevent the worst effects of climate change happening? Because I guess a lot of the time we are focused on prevention and we're focused on mitigation and trying to reduce risks as they appear, but is there anything community safety can do as well to contribute to avoiding climate change becoming as bad and meeting targets that are going to be set in terms of that? So yeah, just what are your thoughts on those things?
Well, I mean, very definitely both, David, because there is the understanding that in the very short to medium term, what you need to do is adapt. To adapt and to mitigate against what's already happening, and then looking further into the long grass to reduce what has happened and ultimately aim to reverse it. So you can take it on a kind of micro level, on an individual household, look at the way that we've changed into heading towards what we call circular economy, or heading towards net zero. So that's simple things like your local recycling service and the ability to reduce, well, let's start at the hierarchy. You should be able to reuse more things. And we've all got a responsibility, as do our manufacturers out there in the wider business community, as do governments in terms of passing legislation to ensure that we are using manufacturing and sharing products which have got longer lifespans, are made from less damaging materials, and which can be easily fixed or reused in other forms, if not then recycled if they can't be reused, going all the way down into that kind of final kind of murky area of the hierarchy, which is, okay, if you can't reuse it, you can't recycle it, what's your next option? Well, you don't want to bury it in landfill and create more methane production. What you, in some areas, are able to do is to extract the best energy from it through energy from waste plants, but those by themselves are very controversial. So going back up, what can an individual do? An individual can create less waste, can utilize, the best services that are on offer to them locally, but take ownership of the materials that they buy, that they throw away, that they, might be able to share. Everything through recycling, through Freegal, Free Cycles, Gumtree. There's any number of things which technology has now made it easier for you to be able to either buy secondhand, rent rather than purchase. So there's one startup called Shoda, SIODA, which is a new upper market clothes rental business. Very hygienic, very environmentally sustainable, very ethical, in the way that it's run. I mean, it recognizes an awful lot of people don't necessarily either have the money nor the will to go out and pay a huge amount of money on something which is maybe only going to be used once or twice. So there's individual actions that people can take in terms of their consumerism and the way that they manage things at home. Buy less packaged goods. If you have to buy something which is overly packaged, take out that packaging and give it back to the supermarket. The more that it costs a supermarket to deal with a waste problem, the less waste they will ultimately produce. That sounds a bit hardline, because we are always trying to work with these organizations because they can see the financial benefit of reducing waste and energy use, because they're wanting to deliver profits to their shareholders. Perfectly legitimate. But as an individual, haven't I got a responsibility to see if I can buy something that's been locally produced, grown, distributed, sold? Yeah, I absolutely do. And I'm lucky that I live in an environment where I can go down and I've still got a local greengrocers, I've still got a local butchers, I've still got those kind of facilities that I can either walk to or order in from. So individual actions like that on a micro level may seem like you're just dripping, but more drips, more flow, more results. Then on the kind of macro level, obviously you've got lots of innovation. You might have seen the Earthshoot Prize recently that was introduced by the David Attenborough and team, and that was really recognising that really innovative, imaginative, creative, and bold solutions are being looked at, particularly by younger people. And I'm very sick of hearing, so many people of my age and generation constantly blaming younger people for every ill. We've been a significant part in creating the problem, and it's the younger generation that are playing the significant part in repairing and restoring, recognizing the issues. So yeah, there's that kind of technology-driven approach to improving the way that we both provide services, look at the proliferation of electric vehicles, trains, using the public transport rather than even your electric car. All those kind of aspects have an individual decision or behavioural change, as well as needing the manufacturing, the business community to provide that service, and government to provide the environment in which the business can thrive and the communities can thrive as well. So yeah, I feel passionately that we've all got a role to play individually, and making sure that our representation, both in parliaments, and locally as well, actually, deliver and lead by example, because in a lot of places it doesn't happen. Sorry, I've rambled on quite a lot about waste and resource efficiency. You were maybe looking at something that was more directly relating to flooding, to climate change, like flooding, no?
No, not necessarily. That was interesting stuff. And yeah, you were kind of talking about the role for government and a big role for local government in community planning partnerships and creating environments that allow people to, because it's that whole nudge theory thing, like people will do it if it's easy to do, if it's the easiest choice to make but if
Yep.
it's a more difficult choice to make, people are just not going to do it. So if you make it easy for people to cycle, easy for people to use public transport and get where they need to get to, then they might, and affordable, by the way, for them to do it. Because when you were talking there, I was thinking the individual responsibility thing is obviously, you mentioned smoking. You know, a lot of the time government will try to place more and more offload responsibility onto individuals, but not do enough to create the conditions where people are able to make the healthiest or best choices. And I guess with climate change, it can be like that too. Even with the individual responsibility, yeah, we do have a responsibility to make individual choices that help with it. But if there might be a class component to that, even, and an inequality component, because if someone is really stressed, working really hard, do they have the money? Do they have the time? Do they have the energy to invest in all of the stuff that you were talking about? I mean, even myself, I'm, I guess, probably middle class earner. I'm single. I don't have any kids, and yet I struggle with the amount of personal life administrative minutiae. And it's that way of like trying to recycle stuff. I find that recycling collections aren't always collected by the council. Then I've got to submit reports, which becomes, it's almost like paperwork I'm having to do, and then separate the recycling, decide clean stuff, so wash inside of pots and jars, because if they're contaminated, they can't be recycled.
Which uses your energy and costs you more money to do, and might logically, you know, affect people's willingness to actually do that, because they don't have money to pay for the extra heating.
Yeah, well, but even just it's the time thing and the energy. Like if you've had a really hard day, are you going to want to come home and start dealing, and you've got bills and all these other forms and things you accumulate just by being one person who's being alive, never mind if you've got kids that you've got to manage, and then you've got to do all this recycling and kind of extra cleaning and stuff. Like, it's just time and energy that a lot of people, I guess, won't have. And
they're holding down more than one job. If they're, you know, they've got childcare, they've got a whole bunch of other things that are always going to take priority and precedence. You know, I know that I'm relatively lucky in that I have chosen to live in an area, and I've been able to afford to buy a place which has a decent sized garden. So having, you know, 3 different large bins is easily, you know, managed by me. And to be honest, the local authority is quite good at its waste refuse recycling and collection. But I am conscious that I'm in that lucky. If I lived in a flat, if I lived in a city centre, if I lived in a number of other environments, I would neither have the space for all the sorting, the collection, and the cleaning, nor would I necessarily have, you know, the time or the ability to store, you know, what's required when it's required, get it out on time, have the space to do it.
Well, and I think that's something I find. So I live in a flat, and I've got, because of missed recycling, they seem to be good with collecting the actual bins, but the recycling bins not so much. So I've got two black bags of recycling sitting in cupboards in my house, because and a big bunch of recycling in the kitchen, because the bins outside have been full for about a month and a half. And
I'll tell you what, David, I won't pretend that local authorities haven't got it incredibly difficult on a very difficult kind of you know, budgetary decrease and similar. And there are some areas that simply manage it better than others, some areas which have got more inspirational leadership, or, you know, a greater willingness to actually kind of bite the bullet. And I've lived in different local authorities that have a different attitude, shall we say. And I feel desperately sorry that throughout COP26, which obviously starts in a few days from when we're talking now, that an awful lot of people, delegates from across the world, are going to be coming to Scotland and faced with a transport system, rail of which, the rail side of it, of which is going to be on a fathomless strike, a potential cleansing strike in the Glasgow area as well. And, you know, we're not going to be seen as the kind of modern and progressive society that we both are trying to be, and are seeking others to understand that we're trying to be. And that makes me feel, you know, both embarrassed, but also determined to make a difference.
Yep. And definitely it's something we all need to put our weight towards, because it's the planet is the only home we're ever going to get. And if we waste it, and it's on all of us. It's not on. We can't delegate responsibility elsewhere if we want somewhere.
A certain one several years ago, and actually it was about 20 years ago, and there was a lot of discussion in government and academic circles about the use of the word sustainability. And there was all sorts of incredibly fancy, complicated, technical, impenetrable ways for people to describe it. Until one guy, in the middle of one of these conversations, actually came up with the best phrase I've ever heard, which was, "Do you know what? To me, it's just like treating the planet as if you plan to be here tomorrow."
Yep. No, don't make a mess of your own house because you're going to need to live in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks very much then, Stuart. We'll need to leave it there for today. That was really interesting, so thanks for your time.